For centuries, both Europe and Japan were shaped by warrior elites whose names still echo in legend: the samurai and the medieval knight. These two classes of fighters lived half a world apart, yet they both became symbols of honor, discipline, and the clash of steel on the battlefield. But the question still sparks debates today. If a samurai faced off against a European knight, who would win? To answer that, we first need to understand the worlds that forged these warriors. In Japan, the samurai rose to power during the late Heian period, around the 10th century. They were mounted warriors, archers on horseback, who pledged loyalty to their lords. Over time, they evolved into the ruling class of feudal Japan, serving under shoguns and enforcing the strict code of Bushidō, the way of the warrior. Their world was one of discipline, loyalty, and constant readiness to fight, but also one of poetry, calligraphy, and philosophy. In Europe, knights emerged around the same time, in the early Middle Ages. Rooted in feudalism, knights swore loyalty to kings and lords in exchange for land or wealth. They fought for God and their sovereign, bound by the code of chivalry. Like the samurai, they were expected to be both warriors and gentlemen, combining ferocity on the battlefield with devotion to faith and duty. Though separated by continents, samurai and knights shared a role. They were both the armored backbone of their societies, entrusted with protection, justice, and war. No comparison is complete without the tools of battle. The samurai's most iconic weapon was, of course, the katana. Forged through a meticulous process of folding and tempering steel, the katana was razor-sharp, capable of cutting with incredible precision. Wielded with two hands, it was fast, deadly, and versatile. Yet, samurai did not rely on the katana alone. Earlier warriors mastered the yumi, a long, asymmetrical bow designed for use on horseback. Spears, naginata polearms, and eventually firearms also filled their arsenals. The knight, by contrast, wielded the longsword, a heavy, double-edged blade designed for both cutting and thrusting. Unlike the katana, which excelled in slicing motions, the longsword was a brutal all-purpose weapon, capable of smashing through armor or piercing chainmail. Knights also carried lances for mounted charges, warhammers for crushing blows, and crossbows or longbows for ranged combat. Here, we already see the first major difference. The katana was optimized for speed and cutting against lightly armored foes. The longsword was designed for raw power against heavily armored opponents. If a samurai's blade met a knight's steel plate, the katana might shatter before it pierced. But if the fight took place without heavy armor, the samurai's precision strikes could overwhelm a slower opponent. Armor was another key distinction. Samurai armor, known as o-yoroi and later domaru, was crafted from lacquered iron plates bound together with silk cords. It was surprisingly light, allowing for mobility on the battlefield. The iconic kabuto helmet often featured fearsome designs meant to intimidate opponents. Samurai armor could deflect arrows and absorb strikes, but it was not invulnerable. Against a piercing thrust or a musket ball, it could fail. Knights wore progressively heavier armor as the centuries advanced. Early chainmail offered flexibility, while later plate armor turned them into walking fortresses. By the 15th century, a fully armored knight could withstand most sword strikes and even many arrows. But this protection came at a cost: weight and reduced agility. Though surprisingly mobile for their bulk, knights could not match the quick movements of lightly armored samurai. Imagine the scene: a samurai darting and weaving, katana flashing, against a knight encased in steel, relying on sheer toughness. The outcome would depend on endurance. Could the samurai strike a weak point before the knight landed a crushing blow? Both samurai and knights trained from childhood, but in different ways. Samurai boys were raised to fight, learning archery, swordsmanship, and horsemanship alongside reading, writing, and poetry. They were taught that death was nothing to fear, for loyalty and honor came before life itself. Knights also began young, as pages and squires in noble households. They learned to ride, to hunt, to wield weapons, and to serve their lords. Their training was physical and spiritual, emphasizing loyalty to God and the church as much as to their feudal masters. The samurai's Bushidō emphasized discipline and acceptance of death. The knight's chivalry emphasized piety, service, and courage. Both created warriors who were not only skilled, but also deeply bound to codes that defined their identity. Samurai fought in wars that emphasized speed, strategy, and honor. Battles often began with archers exchanging fire before cavalry clashed. Duels between champions were common, where a samurai would call out his lineage before charging into combat. Over time, battles grew larger, with ranks of ashigaru foot soldiers wielding spears supporting mounted samurai. Knights fought in the brutal wars of medieval Europe. They led charges of heavy cavalry, smashing into enemy lines with lances. In sieges, they climbed walls, wielded crossbows, and endured days of brutal combat. Unlike the more ritualized duels of Japan, European warfare was often a chaotic grind of attrition. The contrast is striking. Samurai warfare was deeply personal and honor-bound. Knightly warfare was mass violence, where the strongest armies prevailed. So, who would win in a duel between a samurai and a European knight? The answer is not as simple as one might think, because victory would depend on time, place, and circumstance. A samurai armed with a katana facing a knight in full-plate armor would be at a severe disadvantage. The katana, designed for precision cutting, would struggle against steel plate that could deflect or absorb even powerful strikes. The knight's longsword, mace, or warhammer, on the other hand, was built precisely for fighting armored opponents, and a single crushing blow could end the fight. But change the conditions, and the balance shifts. If the knight fought with lighter armor, or if the clash happened on open ground where agility mattered more than endurance, the samurai's speed and technique could prove decisive. With the ability to strike quickly at weak points, a samurai might disable a knight before the heavier warrior could bring his strength to bear. Weapons are only part of the story. The mindset of the fighters also mattered. The samurai lived by Bushidō, a code that demanded readiness for death at any moment. To a samurai, the outcome of a duel was less important than the honor of facing it without fear. Knights lived by chivalry, a code that placed loyalty to God, Lord, and Lady at the center of life. They too were fearless, but their focus was as much spiritual as martial. Both entered battle prepared to die, but each carried a different philosophy into combat. When we look at history, we see that samurai and knights were both masters of their own unique worlds. Samurai warfare often involved mobility, archery, and ritualized duels. Knightly warfare emphasized heavy cavalry charges, sieges, and large-scale brutality. The samurai might outmatch a knight in one-on-one swordplay without heavy armor. The knight might dominate on a battlefield where strength, numbers, and armor ruled. So, in truth, the answer to who would win lies not in the clash of steel but in the recognition that both were products of their time. The samurai and the knight represent two solutions to the same problem: how to fight, how to serve, and how to live with honor in a violent world. Both achieved greatness in their own ways, and both left behind legacies that still inspire us today. Even after their classes faded from history, their legends endured. The samurai live on in tales of loyalty and swordsmanship, in films, anime, and modern martial arts. Knights live on in the stories of King Arthur, the Crusades, and in the very idea of chivalry. When people imagine warriors bound by honor, they still picture a samurai with his katana, or a knight in shining armor. Perhaps the true answer is that no single duel could ever decide the question. The samurai and the knight were not rivals but reflections of different civilizations, each showing us how human beings across continents sought to balance violence with virtue. And in that way, both won, for both still live on in our imagination.